Hi there, I'm Luke and I've just put the finishing touches on this little guy. If you'd like to learn how to make one for yourself, this is a complete step-by-step video broken into chapters in the timeline, so as you progress with your own project you can come back and find the parts that are relevant. Doesn't have to be a chimp, could be an elf, whatever else your imagination can come up with. The process will be very similar. I will also cover off a lot of the mistakes I made, and I did make a lot of them. That way you can avoid the same pitfalls. Let's get down to business. Monkey business, chimp business. First things first, we're going to have to source a little bit of timber for our project. I'm not a big believer in going out and buying expensive timber. This is just a lump of olive wood that I found. It ended up having a bit more moisture in it than I initially thought, so it caused a few little splitting and cracking issues. But because I'm painting the final chimp, then I really didn't see it as a problem. As long as I can get these size pieces out of it, then we are good to go. The head is the most logical place to start for me. I think it's easier once you start to bring your final piece together. If you don't like the proportions of the limbs to the head, it's easier to shorten up the limbs, obviously. You could try and go back and make the head smaller, but you definitely can't carve it bigger. You can't put the material back. So this makes the most sense to start here. Okay, like anything, the best place to start is at the beginning. So let's cover off a few of the technicalities of power carving. If you look in the top left corner, you will see the tool I'm using. I'll also list out the name of the blade that I have attached to the power tool. Before we get back to talking about power carving, I'm just going to quickly remove a little bit of extra timber here. Next, let's talk a little bit about speed settings. If you are carving with a blade, a toothed blade, such as the Mini Pro on the Mini Carver, it seems counterintuitive, but you want to have the speed setting at maximum. This will make it a smoother and more enjoyable experience for you. So on a Mini Carver, that is a speed setting of 6 on the variable speed motor. When using a sanding attachment though, however, back that speed right off to about a 3 so we can avoid burning the wood. Okay, and just one more tip to help get us underway, and that is to consider how we're going to clamp things like the head. As you remove more and more material of something that is basically round, obviously it becomes harder and harder to keep it stable in a vise. So leave a bit of extra material on the neck, for example, so you've got somewhere to clamp onto. It will make your life a lot easier, because to try and carve onto an unstable piece of wood can often end in disaster. Power carving, by its very nature, is a fast and efficient way of removing wood, but it's important for us not to get too overzealous with the old carving attachment, because we cannot put the material back on once we've removed it. So if you're getting to a stage where you're not quite sure where you're at, just stop, put on a sanding pad and smooth it all out. Often it will become very apparent that we need to remove a bit more wood, but it will just give you that little bit of confidence that you've not gone too far, and you will be able to see exactly where your project is at. Now let's address the biggest elephant, or should that be chimp, in the room, and that is that some people will say that they don't have an eye for this kind of thing and they're just not creative. I think that's a nonsense. I think to create things is human and it's in us all. I think it's deeply satisfying to have something in your hands that you've crafted yourself. And at the end of the day, you end up with something that is unique to you, either to keep for yourself or to give to a loved one. And I don't see the harm in giving something like that a go. It's a great hobby, it's a lot of fun, and it's super rewarding. Okay, so I'm aware this can't be all philosophical peace, love and flowers, so here is 2 practical tips to help you in your artistic endeavour. 1. If you look at what I'm sculpting, quite often you will see pen or pencil all over the wood. I'm constantly marking up little guides of where to remove the wood. I carve away, mark it up again. especially if you start to look at the piece on all different sides and mark up a side view and mark up a front view, it will become very apparent the bits that you need to remove. I can hear people now saying, well, how do you know where to draw on the timber? And that comes down to point number 2, reference material. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go to the library, take out a book and return it with pages missing and wood chips all through it. Rather, if possible, jump on the internet and print out images of chimps from as many different angles as you can find. And take that with you to wherever you're carving. Keep it on hand. Because as sure as night follows day, you will ask yourself life's great questions such as how wide are a chimp's ears, what shape are their brows, and how far back into the head do their eyes sit. Alright, I know I said only 2 points, but let me put in a bonus point number 3. And that is to not beat yourself up as you go along with this process. Because if you're anything like me, you're going to yo-yo up and down from, oh, this should be in the bin, to, no, it's going okay again. It's a process. Just keep going, be patient with yourself, and have fun with it. And I promise if you persevere all the way through and complete the project, you are going to end up with something that is unique to you and a lovely little item. Here I am starting to put in some of the really small fine details. I'm using a Dremel here, but there are lots of rotary hand tools out there. They're great for this kind of work. I put these smaller details in reasonably early because I find that it helps keep me enthusiastic about the project as it starts to come to life a bit more. Once I'm finished with the Dremel, I've just decided to remove a little bit more material from around the back and top of the head. Once again, just a reminder, if you're using the sanding pad, back that speed off down to about a 3 so you don't burn your wood. You are about to watch me use a different kind of sander. Now you might be thinking a sander is a sander. Well, not quite in this case. This is the random contour sander attached to the Power Carving Unit. The beauty of this is that as you push it and it molds down into the shapes that you've carved, if you push it too hard, it won't just keep spinning and removing the timber and possibly destroying what you've made. It will just stop and vibrate. It will be sanding a little bit, but not much. So you can really sort of push it down into all the nooks and crannies and get a nice smooth finish on what you've created. It's an absolutely fantastic little thing. This does raise an interesting point, however, and that is that you do not need the full suite of Arbortech tools to attempt this project. You really only need the mini carver. It is the perfect place to start your power carving journey. The only other bits of equipment you would need is a drill and a little rotary tool. Here I'm just mixing up a little bit of glue and sawdust to patch up the cracks, which I will sand back off once it sets. Now the other important thing to note here is remember my point earlier that I said I left a little bit of extra material on the neck for clamping. You can see how big the neck is in this shot. In the following shot you will see that I've slimmed it right down. But the other thing to note is the curve in it. Chimps have their heads hunched forward when you look at a lot of pictures of them. By doing this and using the angle of the body, I'm able to get the head to project forward a little bit so he hunches over. The next thing to note is drill the hole before putting the hook in. You don't want to spend all this time and then split the head open by just ramming a screw in there. Next we will move along to the body because without the body it ends up just creepy. Now, if by some small chance you're actually enjoying this video, then don't forget to check out the rest of our YouTube channel or our website. There are tons and tons of project videos on there. Everything from furniture making right the way through to beginner projects like wooden spoons. So please subscribe. Any questions, throw them in the comments below. We will get back to you. Okay, so let's make a start on the body. You can see here that I'm using the TURBOPLANE fitted to the Power Carving Unit. It is a 100mm 4-inch disc, twice the size of the Mini Pro on the Mini Carver. It is a great tool, it's super efficient, carves super smoothly and is very controllable. But like I said earlier, You could do this with the mini carver. It's just that I happen to have every Arbortech tool on hand in the studio, so I'm picking the quickest options. We also talked a little bit about speeds in the opening of the video. The TURBOPLANE is also the same as the Mini Pro. You want to push the speed up to maximum, it will carve a lot smoother. So on the Power Carving Unit, that is a speed setting of 6. Now we are really underway and starting to remove quite a bit of wood. As we discussed earlier about drawing onto the timber and taking a step back and looking at it, carving a little bit more, maybe sand it up a little bit, what you'll also need to now do is start to compare it to the head that you've already made. So from here on out, keep the head handy, just so you can judge if you are making the body a bit on the small side. When in doubt, keep it a bit larger because you can whittle it down a bit more as you refine the shape. Here it is, folks, the biggest boo-boo of the entire project, all stemming from straight up good old-fashioned bad planning on my behalf. At this point of the project, I hadn't actually fully solidified in my mind how I was going to put it together. I had not purchased the hook for the neck, nor the three-way fishing swivel for the chest cavity, but like an idiot, I ploughed on and drilled the holes that would house them. The end result of my haste, remembering the slow and steady wins the race point that I made earlier, is that the hook and the three-way swivel end up being way too close together. I can't get enough tension on them for the head to have a nice snug fit. They're not pulling on each other enough. Therefore, the head bobbles around more than I would like. It wasn't a deal breaker, but it did grate on me just a touch. So I think you all get the point of what I'm saying, and that is do not start this part of the project until you've purchased your swivels and hook. So to help you out, here is a list of all the things you will need as you start to put it all together. I also thought I would just quickly double back to this shot because it's the best one to demonstrate the angle on the top of the body. This also helps to project the head forward when used with the curvature of the neck. It's another reason you really need to have the head on hand as you carve these bits so you can judge as you move along. Okay, so here you can see that the body's upside down and I'm going to create a couple of cavities for where the legs are fixed to. The mini carver will make pretty quick work of this, and I will also refine the shape of his belly a little bit more. Here I've swapped over to the sanding pad just for some more fine shaping, and as I've said before, it gives you great control to put in some of these finer details. Every happy chimp needs a belly button and a couple of nipples apparently. I can't tell you why I did this, but once the thought was in my head, then I just had to go through with it. This is actually a critical step for the function and movement of the chimp. I'm rounding out these holes with the Precision Carving System drum sander because on the top of the shoulders, in the shoulder joint, there will be a little nub. And if you picture that as a ball sitting down into this hole, you can quickly picture that you could spin the ball in any direction and it would also hold it snugly in place. Without this, the range of motion would be significantly reduced. Once again, just adding a little bit of detail on the back because I don't want it all flat and smooth. I want a few raised bits for his fur that I am planning to highlight the tips of with a bit of gold pen later on. We are really moving along with the project now and getting down into these little bits and pieces. So we'll make a start on the arms or shoulders here. I just cut off a couple of chunks of olive wood, one for each arm. And here with a mini carver fitted with the Mini Pro, It makes light work of removing the material so I can get down to the shape that I'm chasing. Once again, I've left a little bit extra because it's better to leave it too big than to end up with something too small. I could have used the sanding pad on the mini carver, but because I already had this set up on the Power Carving Unit, I just thought I'd use this instead. And you'll also note that it's a pretty long arm compared to the finished product. That's because I'm making both sections at once. I'll just chop off the bottom section like so once I've got the final shape roughed in. For those of you playing along at home, I just thought I would point out, even though it is quite obvious, that from here on out we have to make two of everything, or we're going to be the proud owners of a one-legged, one-armed chimp. The real important part to note on this particular piece is the little nub on the inside of the shoulder. That's what sits down into the shoulder socket and holds it in place. Once we introduce these to the bandsaw, we will end up with a complete arm set. Time now for a little bit of drilling because eventually we need to pull some cord through the shoulder. Now I opted for 4mm thick cord. It was overkill, but it was all that I could get my hands on at the time. Now the little trick here is one, do your pilot holes before you jump to your bigger drill bit. But your drill bit needs to be a couple of millimeters wider than your cord. And that is because on this particular piece, you need to drill from two different angles and meet in the middle. If you're slightly off with that little bit of extra slack, you should still be able to pull your cord through. You don't want to drill too deep in either direction because you will go out through the top of the shoulder or out through the side. So mark on your drill bit the total depth that you want to go to so you've got a guide. Take your time and don't rush because it is a little bit tricky to get right. Later in the video, when it comes to putting the chimp together, I will show you a little bit of a trick of how to pull the cord through. It will help to compensate for any misalignment. I want the chimp to have pronounced hairy shoulders, so I am just putting in a little bit of detail here. So there will be some raised bits for me to highlight with some gold pen later on. And to finish the piece off, we just need to round out the bottom hole. Let's now turn our attention to the lower limbs. To start with, simply drill the hole to the same diameter as the shoulder. Now after looking at these, I decided they were too thick, so I wanted to slim them down quite a bit. It is a fiddly little piece, so find a way to keep your hands well clear when sanding. To finish it off, we just need to round out the holes on both ends. And on the end that's going to connect to the hand or the foot, make sure there is enough width and depth that when you tie a knot into your fishing swivel, that you can poke it all back up inside the limb. We are getting onto the home stretch now, so time to make the upper thigh. A very similar process to the upper arm, just using the mini carver with the Mini Pro to remove the bulk of the wood before switching over to a sanding pad just to refine the shape. Note the length of the leg because it's the same deal, we will chop it in half, and also note that I've put a little bit of junk in the trunk. I have already chopped the leg in half, so now it's time for a little bit of drilling. Now my drill bit wouldn't reach the whole way through, so this was a little trick to try and find the centre from the other end. It seemed to work okay. Again, we will round out the hole on both ends and we will call this done. Besides the head, I think the hands are the most daunting pieces to make. The great news is that you don't need reference material for the hands because unless you've got a bit wild with your power carving, you should be the proud owner of a couple of them. If you're really not that confident with making the hands, then you can go for a less complex shape, as in have the fingers straight, not cupped like I've gone for. Note the pencil markings on several faces of the wood and just how simple that they are. If you think of the 4 fingers as a single plane with just a few bends in it, it will make your life a lot easier. You go back in and carve 3 grooves along and you've got some individual fingers. Don't worry if you end up with a little bit of size variation between the two of them. I certainly have here. It's not a big deal. I think these turned out okay in the end. With the smaller parts, such as the hands and feet, the level of refinement you want to go for is really a personal preference. For me, I like to smooth them up quite a bit before I put on details such as the fingernails. Now, if you want to go for this level, then you will need to do a little bit of hand sanding, hand filing, and even some hand carving. I find myself using what we call here in Australia a Stanley knife. Perhaps it's a retractable knife in other parts of the world. Maybe you can let me know in the comments. But I will reiterate, it is all up to you, and it does depend on how much time you've got to dedicate to your project. Well, if you're still watching, you must really want a wooden chimp, so we best knock out a couple of feet. They won't take us too long, because when you think about feet, they are just a basic L shape. Now we need a little bit of depth to our feet, so you will see that I'm carving in a bit of a step here. The reason for that is that we need to be able to bury the swivel halfway down through the ankle towards the heel. If you carve your feet too shallow, the swivel will sit really high, so just keep that in mind when you're starting out. Whilst I'm just shaping up the rest of the feet here, I thought I'd go back and cover off in a little more detail that why I said earlier in the video that if you're new to power carving and you want to make a project of this size and scale, that the mini carver is the best place to start. Quite simply because it comes with this mini pro blade here and the sanding pad and sanding discs. So it's a complete system ready to roll straight out of the box. No need to purchase any other bits and pieces to make it work. Now, if you're going to be making huge furniture or platters or something like that, then maybe it's not. You'd need to look at some of the other attachments. But it's certainly my favourite tool to use, and it's my go-to for projects like this. Speaking of the sanding disc system, let's flick it on and shape up some of these feet. I know I'm starting to sound like a bit of a broken record, but don't forget to back off the speed when switching over to the sanding pads, and don't be silly like me and forget to hook up the dust collection. You will end up with a lot tidier workspace. We won't be able to paint his nails unless we carve him some in the first place, so we'll put in a few details here and we will call the feet done. These are an absolute pain, so unless there's a trick out there that I'm just not aware of, they require a lot of sanding with the machine and by hand, and it's absolutely painful to try and get them all the same size. So my actual recommendation would be to simply purchase 4 wooden beads and drill the hole out to the correct diameter. Well, if you've been following along and you've made one of these for yourself, we both know we've got some wood chips in places that they simply should not be. But it's now time to bring this project together. The pinning process is very simple. We are just looking to have a two-way fishing swivel, half in the hand or foot, held in place by a metal pin. The metal pin is a nail cut to the correct length, and then to hold the pin in place, we are just going to use a couple of little wooden plugs. Now these wooden plugs can be a matchstick or a skewer. So let's do a little bit of drilling. We will concentrate on the larger holes for the fishing swivels first. So to start with, use a smaller drill bit, put in a pilot hole before moving on to your larger drill bit. We don't want any splitting and cracking, and we definitely don't want to have to recarve any pieces. Make sure the depth of the hole is deep enough to fit the fishing swivel halfway in. Now we move on to the smaller holes for the pins. For these, on the hands and feet, we want to drill straight through from one side to the other, trying to pierce the larger hole straight through the middle. We don't need to drill straight through the body, however. We just need to go a little bit past the hole in towards the centre of the body, because that will act like a natural plug. We'll only have to use the wooden plug on the outside hole. Now, the one thing to look out for is the length of the metal pin. Too long, you won't get your plugs to stay in place. Too short, once there's a bit of tension on the swivel, it could rip out. So take your time, measure things up, and you won't go wrong. If we have done all our drilling correctly, we should be able to thread through our little metal pin, glue in the plugs to hold it all in place, and now all we have to do is leave them to set overnight and then eventually sand these little plugs back down level with the rest of the surface. This is the part of the project that I agonised over the most. I went backwards and forwards on whether I should paint it or not, but after doing this little test block here, I decided to push on. For the places that the skin was showing, I opted for a very, very light whitewash. So I've watered down some white acrylic paint, and the main reason for this is that I still wanted the texture of the wood to show through. I still wanted a little bit of that yellow warmth to show through. After laying down a base coat of black, I'm just building up some layers of dark greys, light greys and even whites. I was trying to give the impression of fur. At this point I was really starting to regret my decision. I thought I'd ruined the entire project, but I had little choice but to keep going. Here I'm just flicking on some highlights to the raised parts. I'm quite despondent at this point. I really was regretting my decision, but I had no choice but to leave it to dry overnight before deciding whether to varnish it or sand it back. After sleeping on it, I decided to push on. I thought it was just way too much work to sand it back, and to do so would possibly ruin it. Now here I'm spraying on some clear varnish. I decided to do that because it's held together under tension, and the friction of the parts rubbing on each other I thought would very quickly rub the paint away. I opted for a matte varnish because I'm not a big fan of very glossy varnish. I think it helps to highlight the shape more when it's matte. I think all the intricate carving gets lost if it's covered in a clear coat of gloss. You will also note here that I've taped over the swivels. I didn't want the varnish to get in and clog up the little mechanism that makes them spin freely. Weepers is just about right. This part of the project almost brought me to tears. I initially thought this drawing pin idea would work, but once I put the resin over them, I realised they were just going to be too wide for the slots that I'd carved. I then thought perhaps if I bought some glass eyes from a teddy bear making shop, but I realised they were probably too big. This wouldn't work either. My third idea was simply to cut some slithers off a business card, a nice thick card, put some gold foil on there, a bit of gold pen and a bit of metallic green pen for a bit of extra colour, and then I built this little mould out of the remainder of the business card, all held together with a bit of blue tack. Bit on the dodgy side, but it seemed to do the trick. I just filled it up with some resin and waited for it to set. They're far from perfect. There's a few little bubbles in there. I don't think it was the best resin that I used, but I quite like how they turned out in the end. They seem to work well once I actually set them into the head. Let's start the fiddly task of putting it all together. So here you see the three-way fishing swivel that we've been discussing earlier on, and you need to tie 2 lengths of your elastic cord to it on either side. It will then sit down in the chest cavity like so. Threading all the limbs on is a pretty straightforward process. The only tricky part is the shoulder, because we have the 2 little holes joining at a right angle and they might be slightly misaligned. The best thing to do is just to tie a little bit of fishing line on one end, thread that through because it will go through, it's a lot thinner, and then just use a little bit of brute force to pull through your cord. It's all just a little bit of common sense. Just thread all your limbs on, pull your cord taut and tie the knot into the hand, then cut your cord off. It should all then be held together nice and snugly. The last fiddly thing to do is to connect this swivel with the hook on the bottom of the neck. I used a bit of wire so I could pull it all up under tension, thread the hook through the eye of the swivel, then let the head fall back down into the neck and then just wiggle the wire loose. It seemed to work okay. Because I disliked the paint job that I'd performed earlier on, I decided to add in these gold highlights with a metallic pen. In the end, I think it saved the project. I like how it came out and it looks great under any kind of lighting. With anything though, it's all a matter of personal opinion. So before you decide on how you want to finish your project, just do a test on a block of wood and make sure you varnish it if you are going to varnish it, because that will affect the colours. There's no right or wrong here, so just do what your heart desires. Be careful, however, because sometimes our hearts can lead us astray. And for some strange reason, mine actually desired a hat for this creature. Now, as I'm sure you can tell by the double-sided tape, glue and this abomination of a sewing stitch, I was completely out of my depth. However, holding true to my philosophy of never abandoning a project halfway through because you might just end up with a gem, I battled on and produced this little hat. In the end, it didn't really suit the chimp, but it looked okay sitting there as a prop beside him, so I think that's where I'll leave it for now. I also think this is where I will leave this video tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it, but furthermore, I really hope that you decide to go and make a project for yourself, even if it's not one like this. So grab some wood, get creative, and remember, chips happen.